A good Erev Shabbos. How's everybody doing? So excited to be learning with you on a Friday. We got a beautiful daf. Let's light up the darkness. Let's learn some Torah for the sake of peace in Israel, and may the hostages soon be free. May all the injured be healed. The mourners be comforted, and may peace, a secure peace, be restored to the land. We say amen. Nancy in North Carolina, Shandora in the Bronx, Bella in Florida, Gordo in Scotland, Sharon in New Jersey, Bill in Missouri, Tom in PA, Randy in Florida. Sharon says, my daughter gave birth to a little boy, 12:32 this morning, and her bat mitzvah anniversary is Chaye Sarah. Oh, that's wonderful. Mazel tov, Sharon. That's fantastic. May the little one grow to Torah, Chop, and Masim Tovim. Say amen. Renee in Indiana. Randy says, I'm Yisrael Chai. Tom says, amen. Welcome, everybody. Our daf is Bava, Kamma, Gimel. Daf Gimel, page 3, here in Tractate Bava, Kamma, the 21st volume of the Talmud. These are the laws of damages. When you hurt somebody else, what's going to be the consequences? How are we going to strive to make people whole and ensure a more just society according to Torah? So, we pick it up at the very bottom of page 2b. And yesterday we were discussing, right, there's these primary categories of injury that you can cause. And then, obviously there's a infinite number of ways that tragically we can, what a person can injure another person. But these primary categories, right, as we learned, are going to be the ox, right? And the ox, we're going to distinguish between the habitual gorer, right, that is known to gore people and animals, and the one that is not, that was innocent. Then within the ox, then we have the category, these are still primary categories as we're learning, that the ox can gore with its horns, right, where the ox itself intends to cause damage. And we include within that biting or kicking because it intends to cause damage, as opposed to eating, right? It's just the way of an ox, and if you put food in front of it, it's going to eat it. And if it's eating, plants or shrubs that belong to other people, that's a form of damage. Or it's simply the way of an ox to walk where it's going, and if it tramples underfoot, that's another primary category of the ox. In addition to the ox, we have the fire, right, which once it's set can become uncontrollable. The pit, which is distinguished in that it doesn't move around, right? You dig a hole, you dig a hole in the public domain. It's foreseeable that somebody might trip over it or fall into it and get hurt. So that's going to be a different form of damages. And then there's the maveh, which seems to be a person that is eating, but it was a little bit unclear what exactly does the maveh mean, and we'll get to that later. Okay, so we pick it up at the bottom of 2b, and now we were talking about this distinction between primary categories and subcategories. And so then we said, well, the subcategories within the primary category of goring produce the same results, right? That kicking or biting is going to have the same consequences as goring if an ox causes that kind of damage. But we learned that Rav Papa says that actually the subcategories are not like the primary category in the way we analyze and the consequences that result, within the sort of more general, I'm not calling it a primary category, we're talking about primary categories of injury that are caused by an ox, and then subcategories within that. But goring, the primary and the subcategories seem to be the same, so it must be that Rav Papa was talking about eating or trampling, that these are primary categories and somehow their subcategories differ from them in some way. So the Gemara asks, Where are eating and trampling? Before we analyze how the subcategories of eating and trampling differ from the primary categories of eating and trampling, the Gemara is going to ask, where are eating and trampling written in the Torah that led them to be classified as primary categories of damage, inflicted by an ox, but we're definitely going to, anywhere where, if you have an ox and, its way, its natural inclination is to go eat and you don't restrain it from doing that, well, that's going to apply to all kinds of animals, right? Or perhaps even, what would be something that's not an animal that its way would be to consume, and so you'd be responsible for. I'm not thinking of an example right now. But anyway, let's just stick to what the Gemara is asking. How do we know that eating and trampling, that an ox causing damage by eating or trampling, that these are primary categories of damage? So the Gemara answers the source is as the sages taught in a baraisa. Again, if you joined us not 3 years ago, then you're wondering what is a baraisa. So the Mishna, right? The Mishna refers to the collection of all the Mishnayos or an individual Mishnah. And so the Mishnah generally, this was a collection of the oral teachings that were set down on paper in about the year 200, redacted by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, usually known as Rebbe. And this was during the Roman persecution of the Jews. Oh, who could imagine that there would be persecution of the Jews? We talk about these kinds of things all the time, and right now we're really feeling that in the world. But at any rate, at that time, the Roman persecution was so severe. This was in the aftermath of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, where the Romans were just literally murdering rabbis right and left, and there was fear that the whole oral tradition, which is, it's half of the Torah, right? The written Torah, the 5 books of Moses, is paired with the oral Torah, which is a tradition begun by God, giving it to Moses at Mount Sinai. The oral tradition would allow the elders in every generation to, analyze questions that just didn't even exist at the time the written Torah was given. So some oral laws were given, but the manner of approaching, poskening, figuring out what the law is in various situations, that was created by God at Mount Sinai. And so the Mishnah was set down in around the year 200. There were teachings of the oral tradition that were considered not authoritative enough to be included in the Mishnah, and those are called baraisas. And then by the year 500 of the Common Era, the next layer of commentary on the Mishnah was set down. That's called the Gemara. And the Gemara and the Mishnah together are the Talmud. Okay, so the Gemara answers that the source for eating and trampling as primary categories is as the sages taught in a baraisa. The verse states, if a man causes a field or vineyard to be eaten, and he sends forth his animal, and it consumed in the field of another. So he caused damage. It could be your ox, it could be your sheep, it could be your goats, it could be your dog. Okay, but they went and ate property that belonged to other people, produce or property that belonged to other people. So you're going to be held liable for that, of course. So the 2 parts of the verse are referring to different categories. So it sounds like your animal went and ate something that belonged to your neighbor. So we see the source for eating. But actually the same verse is the source for both eating and trampling. How so? Right? Again, listen to the verse. If a man causes a field or vineyard to be eaten, and he sends forth his animal, and it consumed in the field of another. Exodus 22:4. So the 2 parts of the verse are referring to 2 different categories. The phrase, and he sends forth, this is a reference to the primary category of trampling, as sending forth results in the animal trampling another's produce and damaging it. And likewise, it states, Isaiah 32:20, happy are you that sow, S-O-W, beside all waters, that send forth the feet of the ox and the donkey. So clearly the term send forth is a reference to trampling by the feet of the animal. And now the phrase, and it consumed, this is a reference to the primary category of eating. And likewise it states, 1 Kings 14:10, and I will utterly sweep away the house of Jeroboam as one consumes with the tooth until it be all gone. Now we're actually on 3a. And the master said in the Baraisa that was just cited, quote, and he sends forth, this is a reference to the category of trampling. And likewise it says, happy are you that sow beside all waters, that send forth the feet of the ox and the donkey. So the Gemara infers the reason that the phrase, and he sends forth, is interpreted as a reference to the category of trampling is that the merciful one writes that send forth the feet of the ox and the donkey. But that's not in the Torah, right? That's later in the book of Isaiah and the prophets. So the Gemara asks, were it not for this verse, with regard to what would you have interpreted that phrase? I mean, couldn't you have figured out that it refers to trampling without looking at this verse later in the Bible? If you say that it could have been interpreted as referring to goring, right, goring with the horns, well, that cannot be, as goring is written in a different verse. That the term goring, the verb, is actually written in the Torah. So if you say that it could have been interpreted as referring to eating, well, that too cannot be, as eating is written in a different verse. So perforce, the reference is to trampling, that the ox can do damage by trampling on the produce of another person. And the Baraisa had no need to prove this from the phrase, in Isaiah, that send forth the feet. So the Gemara answers, well, actually, it was necessary for the Baraisa to cite that verse from Isaiah that send forth the feet of the ox and the donkey. Why? Because it might have entered your mind to say that both this phrase, and he sends forth, and that phrase, and it consumed, are referring to the primary category of eating. And that phrase, and it consumed, is referring to a case where the object damaged is completely destroyed. And this phrase, and he sends forth, is referring to a case where the object damaged is not completely destroyed, right? You might have thought that because the two different phrases are both referring to damage that your ox does by eating, but the distinction between them is that in one case he eats everything, and in another case he eats only a little bit of it, and that's why it was needed to be mentioned twice. You might have thought that. Therefore, the verse that send forth the feet of the ox and the donkey teaches us that the phrase, and he sends forth, is not referring that your animal ate the produce of another, but rather that it trampled the property of another person. Now the Gemara asks, and now that we've interpreted that the phrase, and sends forth, is referring to trampling, so from where do we derive that one is liable with regard to acts categorized as eating in a case where the object damaged is not completely destroyed? The primary category of eating is derived from the phrase, and it consumed. So the connotation of that phrase is damage in which the object is completely destroyed, right? I mean, if the ox eats something, okay, well, we're not getting it back in any way that's going to remain useful. Whereas if he walks over something, I mean, does he really destroy it? Maybe, it's just kind of presses it down. It's not ideal. If we're talking about produce, like grain that was stacked up and the ox kind of walked through this pile of grain. Okay, it was annoying. It's going to have to be moved back. Some of it got a little dirty, but we can't say that it was really destroyed in the same way as if the ox ate it. So the Gemara answers, it is derived because the category of eating is juxtaposed to and therefore similar to the category of trampling. Just as with regard to liability for the category of trampling, it is no different if the object damage is completely destroyed, and it is no different if the object damage is not completely destroyed. So too, with regard to liability for the category of eating, it is no different whether the object damage is completely destroyed or if it is not completely destroyed. So the master said in that Baraisa, when the verse states, quote, and it consumed from Exodus 22:4, this is a reference to the category of eating. And likewise it states, and I will utterly sweep away the house of Jeroboam as one consumes with the tooth until it be all gone, right? So the word consume, this verb, must refer to eating when we're talking about, in the metaphorical sense from 1 Kings 14:10, that God says, I will consume as one does with the tooth, right? Obviously it means like eating. So the Gemara infers that the reason that the phrase "and it consumed" is interpreted as a reference to the category of eating is that the merciful one writes, "as one consumes with a tooth until it be all gone." So the Gemara asks, were it not for this verse from the book of Kings, with regard to what case would you have interpreted that phrase, right? If you're saying that I need the phrase from the book of Kings to understand that the word consumes implies eating, well then, if you didn't have that phrase, what would you say that it means? So if you say that it could have been interpreted as referring to goring, well, that cannot be, as goring is written in a different verse. And if you say that it could have been interpreted as referring to trampling, that too cannot be, as trampling is written in a different verse. So therefore, the reference is to eating. And the Gemara answers that it is necessary for the Baraisa to cite the verse, "as one consumes with the tooth until it be all gone," as it could enter your mind to think that both this phrase, "and it consumed," and that phrase, "and he sends forth," are both referring to the primary category of trampling, and that this phrase, "and it consumed," is referring to a case where the animal went and caused damage on its own, and that phrase, "and he sends forth," is referring to a case where the owner sent the animal to cause damage. Therefore, the verse, "as one consumes with a tooth until it be all gone," teaches us that the phrase, "and it consumed," refers to eating. So the Gemara asks, and now that we've interpreted that the phrase, "and it consumed," is referring to eating, from where do we derive that one is liable with regard to actions categorized as trampling in a case where the animal went and caused damage on its own? Right? You didn't tell the animal, you didn't direct it to trample the produce of your neighbor. It was just, you thought it was going to simply be meandering through the pasture, eating grass, and the animal, saw a pretty cow down the street and the ox went after it, and then it ended up trampling your neighbor's property. Right? So you didn't do it on purpose, but you're still going to be held liable. How do we know that? And the Gemara answers, it is derived because the category of trampling is juxtaposed to and therefore similar to the category of eating. And just as with regard to liability for the category of eating, it is no different if the owner sent the animal to cause the damage, or if the animal went and caused the damage on its own. So too, with regard to liability for the category of trampling, it is no different if the owner sent the animal to cause damage or if the animal did it on its own. So the Gemara suggests, and let the merciful one write only the first phrase, "and he sends forth," and there will be no need to write the second phrase, "and it consumed," as the phrase, "and he sends forth," connotes trampling and connotes eating. It connotes trampling, as it is written, that "send forth the feet of the ox and the donkey," and it connotes eating, as it is written, Deuteronomy 32:24, "and the teeth of animals I will send forth against them." So the Gemara answers, if not for the additional phrase in the verse, "and it consumed," I would say that the verse refers either to this category of damage or that category of damage. It refers either to trampling, where its damage is commonplace, or to eating, where there is pleasure for the animal in the course of its causing damage. Right? When an ox tramples some stuff, it's not doing that to enjoy it. It's just, mindlessly like an animal walking to where it wants to go and ends up trampling something underfoot. But when the animal is eating something, okay, it is the nature of animals to eat when they're hungry. It gives them pleasure to eat when they're hungry. And so that's a distinction between eating and trampling. So the Gemara asks, since both interpretations are of equal validity, let both of them come and be derived from the verse, as which of them will you exclude? Since there is no reason to prefer one category over the other, perforce both are derived, and the phrase "and it consumed" is unnecessary. You might have understood that, and "send forth" is going to include both trampling and eating. And the Gemara answers, the additional phrase is necessary, as it might enter your mind to say that this matter of liability applies only in a case where the owner sent the animal to cause damage. He did it on purpose. But in a case where the animal went and caused damage on its own, the owner would not be liable for damage. You might have thought that. Therefore, the phrase "and it consumed" teaches us that the owner is liable even in a case where the ox went and caused the damage on its own. Why is the owner liable? Because he's the owner, and he should have had more care, taken more care to make sure that the animal wouldn't follow its nature and end up causing damage to the neighbor. Having clarified the sources for the primary categories of eating and trampling, the Gemara proceeds to identify their subcategories. That's where we were headed. Recall that yesterday when we were talking about the subject of primary categories and subcategories, we said that for the laws of Shabbos, there's the primary categories of labor that are prohibited, which were all the types of labor that were necessary to construct the tabernacle in the wilderness, like writing and weaving and dyeing fabrics, etc. And all those labors are prohibited on Shabbos, and those are the primary categories. And then there are subcategories, which are labors that are kind of somehow related to those primary labors, but are not exactly the kinds of labors that you would have used to create the tabernacle. And then what was the difference between subcategories and primary categories? Both of them, if you do an unwitting violation of that prohibition, let's say you didn't know it was Shabbos and you did it, you would be liable to bring a sin offering in the temple when the temple is standing. Whereas when we talked about the laws of ritual impurity, right? So that, for example, a man, who helps out in a funeral and carries, right, the coffin, or even like literally touches the corpse, placing it into a coffin and then the coffin into the ground. So he becomes ritually impure with corpse tumas mace, right? And so he is in the primary category of one who is tameh because he touched a corpse. So if he touches another person, that other person now also becomes ritually impure. But the one who touches the person who touched the corpse, right, the second one down the line, he's not in the primary category of tumas mace. He's in a subcategory. And the difference is, if that second living guy, if he now goes and touches a third person, he doesn't make that person tameh. Right? And so that's the difference between the subcategory and the primary category in ritual impurity, which is distinguished from subcategories and primary categories of Shabbos labor prohibitions, where the consequences are the same. So we're trying to figure out here where there's subcategories of primary categories of inflicting damage, and specifically within the ox category, are we going, we already saw that the subcategories of goring produce the same result as goring. So now we're looking at eating and trampling. And do the subcategories of eating and trampling produce the same result as the primary categories of eating and trampling? And so it will be more like the laws of Shabbos. Or are they going to produce a different result in the primary categories, and therefore this law will be more similar to the law of ritual impurity? So let's see. Where am I? About subcategories. I should have kept my finger on the book. Okay. Having clarified the sources for the primary categories of eating and trampling, the Gemara proceeds to identify their subcategories to determine whether it was with regard to these primary categories of damage that Rav Papa said there are among them some whose subcategories are dissimilar to the primary categories. So, what is a subcategory of eating? Meaning when an ox eats and does damage to the neighbor. It is a case where, for example, an animal rubbed against a wall for its pleasure and damaged the wall, or where it sullied produce by rolling on it for its pleasure. Right? In other words, again, the animal is satisfying its own urge either by eating or rubbing its skin against the wall or rolling around in some produce. In all three cases, it does damage to the produce while it's following its own nature to gratify itself, as it were. If so, what is different about eating that it is defined as a unique primary category? Well, what is different is that there is pleasure for the animal in the course of its causing damage, and the ox is your property, and responsibility for its safeguarding to prevent it from causing damage is incumbent upon you, its owner. So in these subcategories of eating as well, There is pleasure for the animals in the course of the damage that they cause, and the oxen are your property, and responsibility for their safeguarding to prevent your oxen from causing damage is incumbent upon you, the owner. Therefore, the subcategories of eating are not dissimilar to the primary category. So rather, it is apparent that it is the status of a subcategory of eating is like that of the primary category of eating. Therefore, when Rav Papa says there are among them some whose subcategories are dissimilar to them, he must be referring to a subcategory of trampling. So the Gemara asks, well, what is a subcategory of trampling? The classification is applied to a case where, for example, an animal caused damage with its body, not its legs, in the course of its walking, or caused damage with its hair that became entangled with an object in the course of its walking, or caused damage with a rope that is upon it, or caused damage with a bit that is in its mouth, or caused damage with a bell that is around its neck, right? And so, why do we imagine the bull in the china shop? First question, what's a bull doing in a china shop? So if the owner walked his bull into the china shop, presumably that means he sent it forth on purpose. Even though he didn't necessarily send it there to cause damage, it was very negligent to lead your bull into the china shop. So assuming he didn't do that, okay, he planned for his bull to stay outside. But, there was some tasty treat that was left on the counter in the china shop. So the bull walked into the china shop. Now, once it was in the china shop, what did it do? If it, decided that it didn't like all these porcelain cups on the counter and it lowered its head and with its horns went right in and destroyed a bunch of cups, okay, so that would be goring. If it simply walked around the china shop and knocked stuff over, that would be trampling. And if it kind of rubbed itself on the edge of the table to scratch an itch, that would be like eating, right? So those are the three different kinds of primary categories of damage that would be possible when that hypothetical bull is in the china shop. All right, so let's talk about trampling, right? So now it's said that the subcategories of trampling are where it causes damage with its body in the course of walking. It's not trying to damage anything, but it's just a mindless animal. It's walking, and it can cause damage not only with what it walks on with its hooves, but also what it rubs against as it walks by. And that would include that if it has a rope around its neck and it snags on something, or it has a bell around its neck and that snags on something, presumably it swishes its tail as it walks around just in the normal course of things. So if that is true, what is different about trampling that it is defined as a unique category? Okay, so what's different about trampling is that its damage is commonplace, and the animal is your property, and the responsibility for safeguarding it to prevent it from causing damage is incumbent upon you, its owner. Now, in these subcategories of trampling as well, their damage is commonplace, the oxen is your property, you're responsible to safeguard it to prevent it from causing damage, and therefore, and the responsibility for that is upon you, its owner. Well, then therefore, the subcategories of trampling are not dissimilar to the primary category. Rather, it is apparent that the status of a subcategory of trampling is like that of the primary category of trampling. Well, in that case, we've decided that the subcategories of goring, the subcategories of eating, and the subcategories of trampling are all similar to their primary categories. So what was Rav Papa talking about when he said that some of the subcategories are different from the primary category? It must be that when Rav Papa said that, he wasn't talking about an ox at all. He was talking about a pit. A pit? We thought there was the primary categories, ox, pit, fire, and maveh, which we haven't defined yet. Now we're saying that the pit is like a subcategory of the ox? What do you mean? What are you saying? And
But this is what it says. The Gemara says, and when Rav Papa says there are among them some whose subcategories are dissimilar to them, he is referring to a subcategory of the pit. So he's saying he's not that the pit is somehow a subcategory. No, we know that the pit is a primary category. What Rav Papa must have meant is that there are subcategories of the pit being a primary category, and there's subcategories of that primary category that are somehow different from the primary. So let's examine this. What is a subcategory of a pit? Right? Remember, a pit means that somebody dug a hole in the public domain where people, it's foreseeable that people will fall into that hole, either trip over it or literally fall into it, or the animals of people will fall into the hole or even die because it was a very deep pit. Right? So you left a hazardous condition in the public domain, right? That's why you're going to be liable for it. So now the Gemara asks, okay, what is a subcategory of pit? If we say that the primary category of pit applies when, in the public domain, one leaves an uncovered pit that is 10 handbreadths deep, right? So that's 10 tefachim, right? Handbreadth, like this, right? So what we're talking about is something about 40 inches deep. And that's a pretty serious hole. You can imagine falling into something that's 40 inches deep. When someone leaves an uncovered pit that is 10 handbreadths deep, and that is the pit mentioned in the Torah. And a subcategory of a pit applies when one leaves an uncovered pit that is 9 handbreadths deep. Okay, so what we're saying is, like, to actually be called a pit, when the Torah says that you're going to be liable for digging a pit and, people are damaged by it. So what's the minimum depth of that to be really considered a dangerous pit? That means it's 10 handbreadths deep. So if it's not the 10 handbreadths deep, if it's shallower than that, then the Gemara is right now positing that that is what is meant by a subcategory of the pit. It's a less dangerous pit, right? Now, you can imagine that actually there's going to be different levels of hazard, and so perhaps something that is not quite so hazardous would be considered a subcategory that might produce a different outcome. So let's see. And a subcategory of the pit applies when one leaves an uncovered pit that is less than 10 handbreadths deep, where there's only 9 handbreadths deep. So then there is no basis for that distinction. But the Gemara is saying, no, there's no basis for that distinction, as neither 9 handbreadths is written in the Torah nor 10 handbreadths. The Torah does not distinguish. The sages might say that 10 handbreadths is enough to qualify as a pit, but the Torah made no such distinction. So the Gemara explains, this is not difficult. As the Merciful One states in the Torah, and the carcass shall be for him. Exodus 21:34. I think this is when your ox gores the ox of another person. And the sages have an accepted tradition that a pit, this is when you dig a pit and somebody else's ox falls into the pit, okay? That then you're going to be liable to replace the ox that, fell into your pit. But once you bought that guy a new ox, you get to keep the dead ox that fell into your pit. And the sages have an accepted tradition that a pit that is 10 handbreadths deep can cause the death of an animal that falls into it, but one that is only 9 handbreadths deep causes damage to an animal that falls into it, but does not cause death. Now that's interesting because what they're saying there is, let's say that the animal fell in and did die, right? So how can you say that my pit didn't cause the animal? The animal was walking along, it fell into this hole, and now it's dead. It must be that the pit caused the death. But that's not always true. That's not always true at all, right? And there are many murder movies that are based on that kind of idea, that it looks like this was the cause of death, but when you dig a little deeper, you learn, that person was dead already, right? He wasn't killed by the gun. He was already poisoned. He wasn't killed by choking. He was already a drug overdose. That kind of thing. So perhaps what we're saying is, well, listen, maybe the ox fell into a pit that was, 6 inches deep, but you can't say that somebody who left a 6-inch hole in a public thoroughfare is responsible for the death of an ox. that ox was probably going to die today anyway. Maybe the ox had a heart attack. Maybe the ox was just old, right? So you have to be a little bit careful about proximate cause and actual cause, right? So that's why they say the sages have a tradition that, okay, a pit that's 10 handbreadths deep, that could cause the death of an animal that falls into it. But if it's shallower than that, we're not going to say that it caused death. It might have damaged the animal, and the owner is going to be responsible to pay for damages, but not to the level of causing the death and paying for that. So the Gemara asks, ultimately, this pit that is 10 handbreadths deep is a primary category of damage with regard to death, and that pit that is less than 10 handbreadths, it's only 9 handbreadths deep, is a primary category with regard to damage. Right? In other words, if the animal falls into it and breaks its leg, okay, well, your pit caused that. You're going to have to pay for that. But if it's less than 10 handbreadths deep, then even if the animal died, we're not going to say that you're liable as if your pit killed the animal. Now, rather, Rav Papa's statement that there are among them some whose subcategories are dissimilar to them was stated in reference to a different set of subcategories of the pit. Now, we're not talking about a deep pit versus a shallow pit. We're going to be talking about something completely different than a pit, where you left some hazardous object in the public domain and somebody stumbled over it or hurt themselves, and that's going to be categorized like a pit, but not completely. And what are we talking about? That was my reference in the title of today's class, which is a stone, a knife, or a load, right? If, I'm carrying a big sack, of I don't know, melons, right? And it's a hot day and I'm really tired. And I'm like, I need a rest. And I just put down my sack of melons, but I leave it where? Like in a place where people are likely to walk on it and trip on it. If I have a knife and I just drop it because I wasn't careful to secure it and it landed in such a way that the blade was pointed up and then somebody comes along and steps on it, I should have secured my possessions, my stone, right? If I leave like an actual stumbling block, right? Could be a stumbling block before the blind, right? Well, if you actually leave a block, like a cinder block on a sidewalk and somebody trips on it, so you were negligent and you're going to be liable for that. And those items are considered similar to a pit because unlike an ox or a fire, they don't move around, right? They just stay where you left them. And that's why, they're related to a pit, but obviously they're a little bit different than a pit. And that's why they're going to be called subcategories, and they're going to be in some way dissimilar from their primary category. So let's see how that works. So Rav Papa's statement that there are among them some whose subcategories are dissimilar was stated in reference to these subcategories of the pit, namely his stone, his knife, or his load. Any of which he placed in a public domain, and they became obstacles, and they caused damage when people stumbled over them. So the Gemara asks, what are the circumstances where one is liable for damage caused by these obstacles? If it is a case where one declared these items ownerless, meaning he was too lazy to take his bag of rocks to the dump and get rid of it there, and he just said, I'll just leave it right here, Declaring ownerless means he abandoned, right? He abandoned them. I don't want it anymore. I'm just going to leave it here. Imagine like somebody has an old fridge, the garage fridge, let's say, and he says, you know what? And it stops working. Okay, it's a 30-year-old fridge. He's not going to bother to repair it. So, and he lives on a hillside. So rather than pay for the city to come haul it away or he himself take it to some kind of a junkyard or dump, the landfill, he just, goes in his backyard and just shoves it off, out the back edge of his property. And it just kind of rolls down the hill and ends up in the woods, right? Ownerless property. He doesn't want it anymore. Not his problem anymore. But you know, an old fridge is very dangerous because children might play and get inside the fridge and then get locked in and not be able to get out. It's an extremely dangerous situation. So is the fact that he threw it away, abandoned it, just pushed it off his property down a hillside, does that mean that he's not responsible if, God forbid, some children are playing and get in the fridge and they hurt themselves? No, he is responsible, right? So just declaring it ownerless and saying it's not my problem anymore doesn't mean that it's not your problem anymore when you left a hazardous condition in a public domain. Where am I? Ownerless, right? So what are the circumstances where one is liable for damage of the stone, the knife, or the load? If it is a case where one declared these items ownerless, well then, both according to the opinion of Rav and according to the opinion of Shmuel, cited later in the Gemara, these cases are a subcategory of pit, as both Rav and Shmuel agree that any obstacle declared ownerless by its owner that causes damage in the public domain is a subcategory of pit, meaning they're still responsible. It doesn't matter that they declared it ownerless. Even though they said, okay, anybody can come along and take that fridge if they want it. Anybody can come along and take my knife or my stone or my load. It's not my problem anymore. But if they cause damage, it is your problem. And both Rav and Shmuel agree about that. Now we're on 3b. And if it is a case where one did not declare the item ownerless, right? He just put it down for a minute. He was intending to come back and get it. There is still a difficulty. If Rav Papa's statement is in accordance with the opinion of Shmuel, who says, we learned that one is liable for damage caused by all obstacles that he places in a public domain, whether or not he declares them ownerless. And we learn that from the laws with regard to one's pit. And then therefore these cases are a subcategory of pit. And if Rav Papa's statement is in accordance with the opinion of Rav, what does Rav say that's different than Shmuel? Rav says, we learn that one is liable for damage caused by all obstacles that he places in a public domain that he did not declare ownerless, from the laws with regard to one's ox that gored another animal. And these cases are a subcategory of ox. Right? So the difference between Rav and Shmuel for somebody who left something dangerous in the public domain that caused harm to another is that one of them derives these laws from the pit and the other derives these laws from the goring ox. Now, with regard to the subcategories of ox, the Gemara already established that their legal status is like the primary category of ox. So the Gemara asks, concerning an obstacle that is a subcategory of pit, what is different about pit that it is defined as a unique category? Why is it its own category? Why doesn't we just say that the pit generally is a subcategory of the ox? Why don't we say that? Answers the Gemara. It is that its initial formation, i.e. the digging of the pit, is done in a manner that can result in damage, and it is your property, and it is your responsibility to safeguard, to prevent it from causing damage to others, and that responsibility is incumbent on you. Now, in these subcategories of pit, also, their initial formation, i.e. the placement of the obstacle in the public domain, is done in a manner that can result in damage, and they are your property, and it is your responsibility to safeguard them, to prevent them from causing damage. So rather, it is apparent that the status of a subcategory of pit is like that of the primary category of pit. And when Rav Papa says that there are among them some whose subcategories are dissimilar to them, he is referring to a subcategory of maveh, right? So he said that the four main categories of damage that the Torah identifies are the ox, the pit, the fire, and maveh. And we haven't really defined maveh yet, so perhaps we will now. The meaning of the term maveh is not clear. Therefore, the Gemara asks, what is the primary category of maveh, to whose subcategories the Gemara refers? If one suggests that Rav Papa said his statement in accordance with the opinion of Shmuel, well, Shmuel says, maveh, this is the category of eating. Well, then this cannot be Rav Papa's intent, but didn't we already establish that the legal status of a subcategory of eating, like when your animal goes and eats the produce of another, that the subcategory of eating is like that of the primary category of eating. So clearly Rav Papa was not referring to subcategories of maveh, if we define maveh as eating. And if one suggests that Rav Papa said his statement in accordance with the opinion of Rav, who says, maveh, this is the primary category of man, people who cause damage. That's what maveh is, which includes damage caused by people as opposed to their property, right? When a person himself causes damage to somebody else's property, this is what maveh is, according to Rav. A person himself or herself as opposed to their animal or their other property. So according to Rav, if that is what maveh means, what primary categories and what subcategories are there in this category of maveh? The law is the same with regard to all damage that a person causes. And if you would say that there is a distinction, that the primary category is a case where one causes damage while awake, and a subcategory is a case where one causes damage while asleep, but didn't we learn in a Mishna that we're going to encounter on page 26a that the legal status of a person is always that of one forewarned? And he is liable for any damage that he causes, whether he is awake or whether he is asleep. So accordingly, that is not the distinction between a primary category and a subcategory. So we're still trying to figure out, what did Rav Papa mean when he said that there was a subcategory that's different than the primary? Must be fire. No, we're not up to fire yet. Rather, what perhaps Rav Papa was referring to cases where we're talking about maveh and we're talking about damage that a person does. So maveh is defined by Rav. And there's a different kind of damage that people do that's not with their body and not with their property or an animal that they own. Rather, it's with their phlegm or their spittle. If you cough up a loogie and it gets on someone, that could damage them. You could certainly ruin something, some beautiful dish if, your phlegm landed in it. Or if you spit on someone, that I believe under American law, that's considered not just assault, but battery, right? If you spit on someone, is that battery? I'm sure we have a lawyer in the house. So let's see what happens. So perhaps Rav Papa was referring to cases where one causes damage with his phlegm or his spittle. So the Gemara asks, what are the circumstances where one would be liable for damage in that case? If it is a case where his phlegm and spittle caused damage as they were moving through the air after the person expectorated, well, that is damage caused by his direct action. And there is no room to distinguish between the damage that is caused that it caused and any other damage caused by one's direct action. If I punch you in the face or I spit on you, I'm equally liable for whatever damage results from that. Perhaps my punch is more likely, to result in monetary damage, measurable damage to your face. But if I spit on you and I cause you actual damage, and by the way, humiliation, that's kind of psychological damage is real damage that's measured, and that you can become liable to pay for that. And that might be even greater than being punched. So the point is, if my spit lands on you because I spit at you, that's a direct action, the same as if I had punched you. So there's no distinction between spitting and punching in terms of that's a primary category of a person causing damage. But if it is a case where the phlegm or the spit causes damage after it came to rest on the ground, for example, if one slipped in the spittle, right? If I'm one of those guys that chews tobacco and I got this big, disgusting loogie and I just leave it on a smooth floor, and then somebody comes along, steps on that, slips and falls and hurts himself. Okay, so am I liable for his fall in the same way as if I had pushed him and knocked him over? Let's see. If it is a case where his phlegm or his spittle causes damage after it comes to rest on the ground, for example, if one slipped in the spittle, fell and was injured, well, both according to Rav and according to Shmuel, This is a subcategory of pit, not a subcategory of maveh, if we define maveh as the direct actions of a person. Rather, if you leave spittle on the ground and somebody comes along and slips, that's the same as digging a pit and somebody comes along and trips. As the spittle became an ownerless obstacle in the public domain. No one's planning to come back and collect his spit, so we say it's something he abandoned in the public domain. So, rather, since these cases don't explain what we're talking about, it is apparent that the status of a subcategory of maveh is like that of the primary category of maveh. And when Rav Papa says there are among them some whose subcategories are dissimilar to their primary categories, he must have been talking about fire and the primary category of fire, and there must be a subcategory of fire that produces a different result, different consequence than the primary category. So the Gemara asks, what is a subcategory of fire? If we say that it is a case of his stone, his knife, or his load, where he placed them on top of his roof, and they fell off the roof by means of a common wind, and they caused damage, right? That's why they're likening that to a fire, where I started a fire just to have my little campfire, right? But then a wind came along and blew pieces of my fire, into a pile of hay, and the next thing you know, there was a giant conflagration. I didn't mean to commit arson, but I wasn't careful enough with my little campfire, and it ended up causing a lot of damage. Well, that would be similar to leaving a dangerous object on the roof, on my own rooftop, but in a way that was unsecured, where a wind could come and blow it over the edge of the roof and somebody could get hurt below. So is that going to be like a fire? So what is this subcategory of fire? If we say that it is a case of his stone, his knife, or his load, where he placed them on top of his roof, and they fell off the roof by means of a common wind, and they caused damage, what are the circumstances in which one would be liable for the damage that was caused? If it is a case where those items caused damage as they were moving through the air, propelled by the wind, that is a case of fire. So when they dropped, in other words, once the wind knocked them off my roof, and now they're just sitting on the ground, that's a case. Now it's like a pit. But if in the act of falling off my roof, they fell on someone and hurt them, then it's more akin to fire. So if so, what is different about fire that defines it as a unique category? What is different is that another force, the wind, is involved with the fire in causing damage, as the wind causes the fire to spread. And the fire is your property, and responsibility for safeguarding to prevent it from causing damage is incumbent upon you, the owner. In these subcategories of fire, also another force is involved with the items placed on the roof and causes damage as the wind causes them to fall off the roof. And they are your property, and the responsibility for safeguarding them to prevent them from causing damage is incumbent upon you, the owner. So rather, it is apparent that the status of a subcategory of fire is like that of the primary category of fire. And when Rav Papa says there are among them some whose subcategories are dissimilar to them, he was referring to a subcategory of trampling. Didn't we already cover this? Didn't we at the beginning of today's class say that, did Rav Papa mean that there's a subcategory of trampling that is not like trampling? And then we said no, because the subcategories are like the primary category. But now we're back to trampling. Let's see why. Now the Gemara questions this explanation. A subcategory of trampling, but didn't we already establish that the status of subcategory of trampling is similar to the primary category of trampling? And the Gemara explains what it means. Rav Papa was referring to one's liability to pay half the cost of the damage caused by pebbles in a case where they were inadvertently propelled by the foot of a walking animal, which is a law learned through tradition and not explicitly written in the Torah. So interesting, right? If your animal is just walking and it tramples over the produce of another, okay, that's damage through trampling. If your animal is walking and it kicks a rock and that rock hits something, and breaks it and causes some damage to property. So that's not the same as trampling, and we're not gonna say it's the same as trampling because there was another object involved that was propelled by the animal's foot, and that's actually going to create a distinction. So let's learn more about this. So the Gemara asks, but if it is a unique halakhic category, the animal kicking pebbles that then cause damage, why is it characterized as a subcategory of trampling? If you're saying that we have a tradition that particular case, the animal kicking up pebbles that cause damage, that is its own case, and we'll explain why later. But if we're going to say that is its own case, then why call it a subcategory of trampling? Why not just say, okay, there's the primary category of kicking pebbles that breaks other things? And the Gemara explains it is due to the fact that it shares a common aspect with trampling. One whose animal propels pebbles while it walks and thereby causes damage is liable to pay half of the damages from his superior quality property. And he does not pay only from the body of his animal, as is the law concerning half the cost of the damage paid by the owner of an innocuous ox that gored a person or an animal. Right, the innocuous, when we're talking about goring, we said there's going to be a difference between an ox that was known to be dangerous, known to be one that gores other animals or people, as compared to an ox that never did that before, and then for the first time today, it acted very uncharacteristically for itself and ended up goring another animal or a person. And when that happens, because it's innocuous, the owner is going to be liable for half the damages, not all the damages. And he's going to have to, if he doesn't have money or movable property on hand, he's going to have to liquidate some of his real property, his land. And for that purpose, he has to use his superior quality land. Now the Gemara explains, and it is a dilemma for Rava. It is obvious to Rav Papa that one pays from his superior quality property. And in that sense, he classifies the pebbles that cause damage as a subcategory of trampling, as opposed to goring. So the Gemara asks, according to Rava, who raises it as a dilemma, why is it categorized as a subcategory of trampling when its legal status is different both in terms of the extent of one's liability and in terms of the manner of payment? And the Gemara explains it is classified as a subcategory of trampling in order to exempt from liability pebbles that cause damage in the public domain, just as damage in the category of trampling is exempt in the public domain. Now, one of the primary categories of damage that was enumerated in the Mishna is the category of maveh, and another is the category of fire. And the Gemara asks, what is the meaning of maveh? Right? We saw that there was a difference between Rav and Shmuel on this question, right, where Shmuel says maveh is referring to your animal that goes and eats the property of another, and Rav said, no, maveh is any damage done by a person himself, as opposed to his property or his animals. I'm actually going to be done pretty soon. So get your questions or comments in. So what is maveh? So Rav says maveh, that is the category of man, which includes a person who causes damage, but not the property or animal of a person. And Shmuel says maveh, this is the category of eating. And the Gemara elaborates, Rav says maveh, this is the category of man, as it is written, the watchman said, morning has come, and also night. If you will inquire, tivayun, inquire, be'ayu. And the terms tivayun and be'ayu, meaning inquire, refer to a person who is able to inquire. So accordingly, maveh relates to an action performed by a person, because we're talking about words with a common root. And Shmuel says, no, maveh, this is the category of eating. As it is written, how is Esav, right, Jacob's brother Esau, searched out? Nechpesu. How are his hidden places revealed? Nivu. That's from Obadiah 1:6. And the terms nivu and maveh share a common root. And the Gemara asks, from where may it be inferred that nivu connotes eating? And the Gemara explains that it is as Rav Yosef translates the verse into Aramaic. How is Esav searched out? It belish. How are his hidden places revealed? It galayan.
And the meaning of the Aramaic term itgalion means revealed, and that is the meaning of the Hebrew term nivu. So maveh references the animal's teeth, which are covered when its mouth is closed and revealed when it eats. So the Gemara asks for Rav, what is the reason that he did not say that maveh refers to eating, as does Shmuel? The Gemara explains that Rav could have said to you, it is taught in the Mishnah, niveh. Niveh is the passive form of the word maveh, which would be the appropriate form if the reference was to teeth that are revealed. The term in the Mishnah is maveh, an active form of the verb. And as for Shmuel, what is the reason that he did not say that maveh refers to the category of people, man, as does Rav? And the Gemara explains that Shmuel could have said to you, it is taught in the Mishnah boeh? Boeh is a form of the word maveh, connoting an action taken directly, which would be appropriate if the reference. Which would be appropriate were the reference to one's actions that cause damage. The term in the Mishnah is maveh, which connotes an action that one causes others to take. So the Gemara notes, after all, the meaning of the term in the verses is not precise according to one sage Rav, nor is it precise according to the other sage Shmuel. Seems like they were just guessing. It is apparent that their dispute is not based upon their interpretation of the verses. It must be based on some other issue. So the Gemara asks again, as for Rav, what is the reason that he did not say that maveh refers to eating, as does Shmuel? The Gemara explains, Rav holds that the Tana teaches the primary category of ox in the Mishnah. This includes damage caused by an ox and all matters involving damaging actions that are completed by an ox, i.e. the actions included in the categories of goring, eating, and trampling. Therefore, maveh must be referring to something other than what an ox does, and that's why Rav says maveh refers to the actions of people. And the Gemara asks, and as for Shmuel too, who interpreted maveh as eating, doesn't the Mishnah teach the category of ox? And Rav Yehuda said that according to Shmuel, the Tana teaches ox specifically with regard to damage caused with its horn, and it teaches maveh with regard to damage caused with its tooth. And when the Mishnah contrasts ox with maveh, this is what the Tana is saying. The defining characteristic of the primary category of goring, where there is no inherent pleasure for the animal in the course of its causing damage, is not similar to the defining characteristic of the category of eating, where there is pleasure for the animal in the course of its causing damage. And the defining characteristic of the category of eating, where it is not the objective of the animal to cause damage, is not similar to the defining characteristic of the category of goring, where the objective of the animal is to cause damage. And that's how he distinguishes between maveh and goring, right? And that's according to Shmuel. But Rav says, no, you have ox, so all kinds of damage that an ox might cause are included in ox, and maveh must refer to something totally different. It must refer to what people do directly. That's according to Rav. It'll be interesting to see how Shmuel says, okay, well, if maveh, doesn't include people, then where are people included when they do damage themselves directly with their hands? That's what I've got today. Let's check a couple of questions on Bava Kamma, page 3. Sharon, there is an addition to Torah Doraisa, meaning the written Torah, and the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah. There are prophets and writings in the Bible, in the Tanakh. Are those writings included as part of the written Torah as being revealed at Sinai, much like the oral Torah is? I mean, that's such a deep and awesome question. Generally, when we're talking about halachas, right, the 613 mitzvahs. When we're talking about mitzvahs, right, the 613 commandments, those, are written in the written Torah. And then there are halachas, laws, for us to understand what they are. For example, what are the laws of matzah, that it is matzah, or what is tefillin, right? The mitzvah, the commandment that you shall, bind these words as a sign upon your hand and be a symbol before your eyes. That's all the mitzvah says in the written Torah. How do we know that that's the black box and the leather straps? That was a halacha transmitted to Moses at Mount Sinai. So there's probably a lot, I just don't know offhand, but I'm sure that there's halachas that we really understand how to do a mitzvah from verses that are in the later parts of the Bible, right? Beginning with the book of Joshua and going through all of, the prophets, and then eventually the writings that include things, like the Song of Songs, the Psalms, Proverbs, etc. So they're definitely halachas, laws that we derive from later books. But I do think that, Sharon, what you're saying is that my general understanding, right, that when we talk about Torah, the word Torah can mean different things, right? It can mean the first 5 books, the Chumash, right? The first 5 books of the Bible, the 5 books of Moses. That's kind of what we most often mean. But it can also mean, all of Scripture. And then, people had a hand in deciding, right? God said, this is the Torah, and he dictated it to Moses, but that's straight from God. And then, which books ended up becoming part of the Tanakh and which didn't, right? There are books, Hebrew books that were contemporaneous that didn't make it in. And for example, there was a big debate over whether the Song of Songs would be included in the Bible or not. Could have gone either way, let's say. But once it was included, then it's considered, a divine book. Now, how is it that people, even though there were our sages, how did they have the right to decide what was included in Scripture and what was not? For the same reason that God told Moses at Mount Sinai that Jewish law would be decided, right, in every generation based on the precedents established by the generations before. But when there would be new questions, it would be the Gedolim, the great sages of that generation, with all their knowledge, and in a democratic way, but only those qualified to participate in the vote, shall we say, would decide, right? And that would be part of that process, of kind of Torah being revealed in later generations. Now, we take that, that doesn't give us license to say, well, we don't really feel like following these laws now because the modern world is so different. Let's change the law. No, right? No. It's very limited, how Jewish law evolves. It's more like applying established law to new situations. But certainly the prophets and the writings are, they're part of Tanakh. And I think they in that sense, they're considered part of the written Torah. But I'm not a rabbi, and I think that there's a lot more sort of philosophically and theologically at stake here than I can answer. So it's a big question, a great question, and we should ask the Gedolim of our generation, not me. Now, Renee says regarding spitting, it's assault. Thank you. Marjorie, this will be fascinating. It reminds me of my life. Arguments over grazing rights and damage caused by goats who were clearing one backyard when 2 escaped and did damage to a neighbor's yard. There you go. That was a hypothetical that I said you actually experienced this. And I like the 4 main categories. Weeds, subcategories, are a mess, but worth the discussion. Okay, I had this situation. In fact, I won't name him, but I used to have a celebrity, very famous person, former Hall of Fame football player. Used to live next door to me, and he moved in many years later than I did. But one thing that happened was when we moved in, we planted a bunch of bamboo on the edge of our backyard, and we absolutely contained the bamboo because bamboo roots are very invasive, but we put a real barrier there. But then what happened was that the people who live next door to us, they sold the house. A new developer came. They tore down that house. And this developer was a cheapskate. And he raised the backyard of the neighboring property. And he just didn't contain the raised level at all. He just raised it up, and the dirt was just lying next to an old wood fence that was part of that property. So at that point, my bamboo, had been contained, but now it had a path to go up that didn't exist before. And so my roots went into that property. And then the second owner of that property, of that new house, because the first one found out it was a cheaply built house and he got out of there. And then the second owner was this Hall of Fame football player.
And he was living there for a while, and then one day I get the call, and he's like really mad at me because my bamboo roots are all over his yard. You know, those invasive roots have gone. Now, that wasn't my fault. We built it with a proper degree of care, and then that later developer changed the condition. Maybe at that point I needed to create a new barrier. I don't know. No one thought of it. We ended up saying, all right, you know what? We don't need to have our bamboo. We'll get rid of all the bamboo just for the sake of peace. But, you know, when your plants invade your neighbors, that's a very interesting issue. And what is that going to be? Is that going to be like your ox? Is that going to be like your pit? Is that going to be something else? I mean, we haven't got to that yet. We shall see. Tom, I look forward to reading the Gemara on what happens if my golf ball breaks someone's car window. You and I should go play golf together. My car has been damaged sitting in the parking lot at the golf course, right, by an errant drive on the first hole. Nobody came and left a note on my car and told me they would pay for the damage. But I chip balls in my backyard all the time, and some have gone over my neighbor's fence. Luckily, I don't think anything ever broke, but you know, on a golf course, right, the people who live on a golf course, do they have an expectation that people who hit an errant ball from the golf course will come and notify them and pay for the damage? Or is it just part of living next to a golf course? Very interesting question. Sharon, finally, last question. How does one factor in the effect of a person provoking or antagonizing the animal, resulting in the animal's bad behavior? So that's a great question. Was it foreseeable that some, you know, let's say a parent walking his child would come down and the child, being a child, you know, goes and provokes the animal? Do I need to have thought when, you know, I just tie my horse to the rail in an old Western, that's enough? Or, you know, because it's possible that a child will come along and antagonize the horse, did I actually need to muzzle the horse, you know, and put like a strap around its rear legs so it won't kick? Or, you know, what's foreseeable? How much safeguarding do I have to do so that I'm not considered negligent? These are wonderful questions. That's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, tomorrow night, Saturday, which will be not quite early now that the clocks have changed. You know, I think we should be able to get on the air by like 7:30, right? I think Shabbos begins here 4:34. So anyway, see you about an hour after Shabbos ends here in LA. Good Shabbos.